On the evening of April 6, 1994, a plane was shot out of the sky over Kigali, Rwanda. The man inside had just signed a peace agreement. Within hours of his death, his own government began murdering his own people. And here is the part that should make you stop and stare at the ceiling for a moment. The people doing the murdering were the same people who had the most to gain from his death. The same people who had, for years, been quietly preparing for exactly this moment. Lists, radio stations, machetes, imported by the hundreds of thousands. Someone shot that plane down, and to this day, nobody has been convicted of doing it. But the genocide happened anyway, on schedule, as if the bullet wasn't a beginning. It was a signal. So who fired it? And does it even matter? Rwanda, 1994. A country the size of Maryland, with a population of 8 million people divided, quite deliberately, into two groups, Hutu and Tutsi. I say divided deliberately because that division, while ancient in origin, was sharpened to a killing edge by Belgian colonial administrators in the 1930s, who handed out identity cards classifying every Rwandan by ethnicity. The Belgians decided the Tutsi were naturally superior, taller, thinner, more European-looking, and elevated them accordingly. Then, in 1962, Belgium left, as colonizers tend to do, taking their theory of racial hierarchy with them and leaving behind a country that had fully internalized it. The Hutu majority took power. The Tutsi became scapegoats. This is, tragically, not a unique story. By the early 1990s, Rwanda was in crisis. A rebel army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, composed largely of Tutsi exiles, had invaded from Uganda. A civil war was grinding forward. International pressure had forced President Juvénal Habyarimana to the negotiating table. The result was the Arusha Accords of 1993, a peace deal that would require Habyarimana to share power with the RPF. Habyarimana signed it, and that, more than anything else, may have been what got him killed. Juvénal Habyarimana was, by all accounts, a man who understood one thing above everything else: how to survive. He had come to power in 1973 through a military coup, which he executed against his own president and justified, as coup leaders often do, by claiming he was saving the country from corruption. He then ruled for 21 years, which suggests he was either a gifted leader or a gifted manipulator. History, reviewing the evidence, votes for the latter. He was Catholic, publicly devoted. He attended Mass, spoke of God's will, and oversaw a state that quietly maintained ethnic hate lists. If that contradiction bothers you, you haven't studied enough powerful men. Habyarimana was from the northwest of Rwanda, and he ran his government like a regional mafia. Loyalists from his home prefecture held the senior positions, controlled the military, controlled the money. These men, his inner circle, would later become known by a chilling nickname: the Akazu, the Little House. The people who lived in the shadow of the president's wife, Agatha, who was, by most accounts, more ideologically committed than her husband. And here is where the story becomes interesting, in the way that all tragic stories become interesting, through the gap between what a man says and what his house believes. Habyarimana had signed a peace deal. The Akazu had not. The peace deal required power sharing with the Tutsi. The Akazu had spent years building a parallel infrastructure for a very different solution. RTLM, the Radio Television Libre des Mille Collines, a radio station that called Tutsi Inyensi, cockroaches. It broadcast daily. It was popular. Interahamwe militias, youth gangs trained and armed to do what armies find inconvenient to do publicly, were already operational. The Arusha Accords, from the Akazu's perspective, were not a peace deal. They were a betrayal. If you're finding this history as grimly fascinating as I am, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from, and none of it will make you feel better about the species. Here is the problem with writing about the assassination of Habyarimana. We do not know with certainty who ordered it. This is not a mystery in the comfortable sense, where a detective appears and everything resolves. This is a mystery in the historical sense, where the answer probably exists, buried in a file, in someone's conscience, or in the grave, and may never surface cleanly. What we know is this: 2 surface-to-air missiles were fired at his Falcon 50 jet as it approached Kigali Airport on the night of April 6, 1994. The missiles came from the direction of the Kanombe military barracks, a facility controlled by the Rwandan armed forces, Habyarimana's own military. Two theories have competed for 30 years. Theory 1. The Hutu extremists of the Akazu killed him because he had gone too far toward compromise, because signing Arusha made him a liability, because the genocide was already planned and only needed a trigger, and a dead president was a better trigger than a living moderate. Theory 2. The RPF killed him to create exactly the chaos that would justify their military advance and their eventual seizure of power. French investigators, for a time, leaned toward the RPF. A Spanish judge issued arrest warrants. The RPF, now the ruling party of Rwanda under Paul Kagame, has rejected this interpretation, forcefully and with the kind of confidence that comes either from innocence or from being in power. What is beyond dispute is what happened in the hours after the plane hit the ground. The killing began within 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Roadblocks were already assembled. Lists were already distributed. The RTLM was already on air. The Prime Minister, a Hutu moderate, was dead before midnight. 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers protecting her were tortured and murdered. No one needed to be told what to do next. Whatever the truth of who fired the missiles, someone had been very, very prepared for this moment. That level of preparation doesn't emerge from grief. It emerges from planning. April 6, 1994, 8:20 p.m. Habyarimana's plane began its descent into Kigali International Airport. He was returning from Tanzania, where he had spent the day in final talks about implementing the Arusha Accords. By some accounts, he was frustrated. By others, resigned. By one account, he told a fellow leader on the tarmac that day, "When I get home, I'm a dead man." History does not confirm he said this, but history does confirm what happened next. 2 missiles rose from the darkness near the Kanombe barracks. The first clipped the wing, the second hit center. The Falcon 50 exploded and fell into the garden of the presidential palace. Habyarimana, his wife's brother, the president of Burundi who was traveling with him, and the crew, all dead. The wreckage burned in the garden of his own home. Within the hour, the Rwandan Armed Forces Chief of Staff, Colonel Theoneste Bagosora, a man who had walked out of the Arusha negotiations saying he was returning to Rwanda to prepare the apocalypse, was chairing a crisis meeting. He did not call the politicians. He did not call the courts. He called the military. If anyone is still wondering who benefited, I invite you to sit quietly with that sentence for a moment. 100 days, 800,000 people, some estimates reach over 1 million, were killed in 100 days. Tutsi men, women, children, Hutu moderates, anyone on a list, anyone at a roadblock who couldn't prove the right ethnicity or knew the wrong person or was denounced by a neighbor settling a land dispute. The UN had troops in Rwanda. General Romeo Dallaire had sent a fax to New York months earlier, warning of the weapons stockpiling, warning of the plan. The fax was received. The world, occupied with Somalia and Bosnia and its own complicated feelings about intervention in Africa, did not act. The French, who had been close allies of the Habyarimana government and had trained some of the same soldiers now manning the roadblocks, were slow to condemn. The Americans, still burned by Mogadishu, instructed officials not to use the word genocide, because using that word would have created a legal obligation to intervene. The word they used instead was acts of genocide, a distinction that, I'm sure, brought great comfort to everyone involved. The RPF advanced. The genocide's architects fled. Some were eventually tried at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha, the same city, the same building, where the peace deal had been signed. This is the kind of irony that history deposits like a bill you forgot you owed. Bagosora received a life sentence. Dozens of others were convicted. Habyarimana's wife, Agata, widely suspected by many investigators of knowing what was coming, was granted asylum in France, where she lived quietly for years before being arrested in 2021 on charges related to the genocide. She was 73 years old. The investigation into the assassination of her husband remains, in the legal sense, unresolved. Rwanda today is governed by Paul Kagame and the RPF. It is stable. It is developing at a remarkable pace. It is also a country where political opposition tends to experience misfortune. Where the genocide is remembered with a seriousness the rest of the world could learn from, and where questions about the full history of April 1994 are not always encouraged. This is not a criticism necessarily. It is an observation about what happens when survivors write history, which is to say, it is an observation about all of history. Here is what the bullet over Kigali teaches us, if we're willing to learn it. Violence at this scale does not erupt. It is constructed. It is built brick by brick over years, through language that dehumanizes, through institutions that are quietly redirected, through identity cards that tell people what they are, through radio stations that tell people what to feel, through lists that tell people what to do when the time comes. The bullet was not the beginning. The bullet was a formality. Habyarimana's death mattered less than the machinery already in motion around him. He may have been an obstacle to that machinery. He may have been its unwitting cover. He may have been, and this is the uncomfortable possibility, a man who had spent 20 years building the exact conditions that killed him, and 800,000 of his countrymen, and who only became an obstacle to that legacy at the very end, when it was far too late for opposition to matter. Power has a way of outlasting the powerful. The systems men build to protect themselves have a habit of developing their own ideas about who should be protected. If you've made it this far, you've just watched history's most expensive lesson in the difference between signing a peace deal and actually wanting peace. Consider subscribing. The next chapter of human civilization is just as instructive and probably just as avoidable. We build the conditions for catastrophe across generations. We hand the trigger to someone or some moment and act surprised when it fires. The plane came down in a garden. The garden was surrounded by a country. The country had been told, for decades, exactly what to do next. The most dangerous weapon in history has never been a missile. It has always been a story, told long enough, loudly enough, to people desperate enough to believe it.